Welcome to Bedtime Myths and Mysteries. Tonight, beneath the thin, watchful moon of October, we walk the crooked path between history and rumor, following the footprints of those who once gathered in the dark. This is the story of the Witches Sabbaths, the secret gatherings and true tales that shape the way we fear and celebrate Halloween night. The night I will tell you about is both older and stranger than the carved pumpkins on your porch. It begins in the long, cold shadows of Europe's forests and moors, where people once read the weather in a crow's cry and judged fate by the fall of a single leaf. In that world, the seasons were gods, and the harvest was a covenant. The door between what we call the living and what older tongues called the other world opened wide on a single night each year. A night the Gaels named Samhain, a seam in time when fires were lit, cattle returned to the fold, and the boundaries between kin and spirit thinned to a whisper. But where light and ritual met, so too did rumor. Whispers spread, gatherings that did not fit the church's calendar, assemblies that laughed at the priest's prayers. These were the Sabbaths, a word that would come to carry the weight of terror. To villagers who heard the stories, a Sabbath was not a simple meeting. It was a night of inversion, where the ordinary rules reversed, where the mirror of the world turned inside out, and where the boundaries between church and field, male and female, human and uncanny, grew porous. Listen close. Imagine a hollowed valley, the air sharp and dry with frost. A ring of stones stands in a meadow like teeth. If you cross the field on the night of October 31st, some would say you could hear music, a low, hollow flute that seemed to come from the earth itself, the thrum of drums and the shout of voices that were both human and not. Figures moved in the dark, cloaks lifted by wind or by flight, skirts swirling like the crowns of flowers, hands lifted toward a sky that smelled faintly of peat smoke and distant lightning. Lanterns bobbed like watching creatures. The soil, heavy with last season's harvest, exhaled as if remembering. Many of the tales told by chroniclers are drenched in the language of accusation. Witches who fed on infants, witches who rode the moon, witches transformed into beasts. Trials were held with torches and trembling witnesses. In those courtrooms, under the harsh light of an inquisitor's questions, confessions were carved like words into bone. Names appear in those records like echoes. A healer called to a dying child, a woman with a garden of rue and rosemary, a man who mended hose and was known to know the weather. The stories swirl until fact and fear are braided. One kind of tale repeats itself across regions. A midwife, solitary and skilled, becomes a suspect when a child is stillborn after a strange breeze slips through a window. A woman who keeps a herb garden and gives poultices finds herself accused when a neighbor's cow fails to calve. The stories twist like smoke. A worship of the night becomes a pact with demons. The turning of the wheel of the year becomes an inversion of God's order. Even rituals meant to heal or to bless were read backward and labeled black art. Touch and trade, the exchange of salves, charms, and knowledge, were recast as conspiracy. Yet the Sabbaths described in folklore are not only instruments of dread, they are also vivid pages from a lost book of seasonal celebration. Consider the bonfires. In Scotland and Ireland, fires were kindled at Samhain to mark the boundary between harvest and winter, to light the way for returning souls, and to purify the land. In many European villages, people would don masks and costumes, not to frighten their neighbors, but to walk between the worlds unseen, to confuse wandering spirits, and to placate fickle house guardians. The masks were sometimes carved from gourds or turnips, faces painted roughly to imitate the unknown. These were practical protections against the thin night. And then there is the darker page, accounts of flight. People spoke of witches who traveled by night, on the backs of brooms, on the spines of goats, or wrapped in cloaks slick with unguents, said to be made of herbs and oils. These stories carried the smell of the uncanny, fabrics soaked with basil and nightshade, ointments that numbed the skin and loosened the mind. An ointment could be an herb used in anesthesia to ease a midwife's pain. To frightened eyes, it was a witch's potion to fly. Where knowledge of plants was medical, ignorance made magic. Where pain required bravery, rumor invented devilry. Listen too for the music of inversion. Tales of Sabbaths often speak of ceremonies that mirrored the Christian Mass, but turned hollow. Chalices filled with foul things, parodies of prayer, spectral figures who mimicked the bishop. In the fever of witch trials, such images were powerful, a grotesque echo of familiar liturgy. But not every parody was conscious blasphemy. Sometimes they were the residue of older ritual forms, misunderstood and labeled monstrous by those who sought to consolidate spiritual authority. The old gods and rites did not vanish so much as rearrange their faces beneath a different name. There are scenes that linger like fingerprints. A cottage in Brittany, where an old woman tended a slow fire and knitted charms into a child's shawl. The shawl would keep wind from chills and misfortune from the household. To her neighbors, it was a small comfort. Under the anxious gaze of outsiders, that comfort became witchcraft. Or imagine a circle of women on a Welsh hill, singing to call the sheep back and to bless the lambs. Their song was the same as the old women had sung for generations, a circle of repeated syllables that fit the turning seasons. When a drought came or a plague of blight, those songs, once routine as ploughing, were read in the book of calamity. As centuries turned and the shadow of persecution lengthened, Sabbaths were not confined to any single image. They were fevered by pamphlets, enlarged by reports and sermons, and given faces by artists who painted devils with horns and cloven feet cavorting with men. The visual memory of the Sabbath hardened, green flames, howling crowds, witches mounting their brooms beneath a full moon. In this new iconography, Halloween itself found a vocabulary: jack-o'-lanterns to frighten away wayward spirits, masks to shield the living from the dead. But these were not inventions of malice alone. They were folk solutions to a world full of danger. Yet consider another reading: Sabbaths as networks. When trade routes and rumor moved across Europe, so did knowledge. Women who practiced healing, who cut spines and set bones, who midwifed births in the dark, communicated across valleys and language barriers. They exchanged recipes for salves, symptoms for ailments, and most importantly, each other's names. These networks could be read as conspiracies by a fearful world. The Sabbaths, if indeed gatherings occurred, may have been the practical meetings of healers and midwives, disguised in law as occult councils. There were times when accusation arrived like a storm. Picture a market square at dawn, a bell ringing, and a woman led through the drizzle with her hands bound. Neighbors pressed forward, some with pity in their faces, others with a hunger for spectacle. The magistrate read from books written in a language of fear, and the woman, daunted, exhausted, perhaps injured by a long night's cold, answered as best she could. The record would preserve only fragments: a name, a list of goods confiscated, a reference to a Sabbath. That fragment became the echo chamber that multiplied fear. Rumor ate the rest. At the same time, there were those who sought to understand rather than to punish. A few quiet scholars, priests who remembered older liturgies with a scholar's curiosity rather than a zealot's fury, wrote notes in margins about folk tales that should be preserved. These marginalia, half gossip and half ethnography, sometimes illuminate the Sabbaths as seasonal gatherings turn sinister by fear. They speak of cloaks worn to ward off cold, of children disguised so spirits would pass them by, of herbs hung over thresholds like a coded grammar of protection. Across mountains and islands, the Sabbaths took different shapes. In one hamlet, a prank might be interpreted as a ritual. In another, a procession of masked lads was a remembrance of ancestors. In the Black Forests, local storytellers spun the Sabbaths into tales meant to scare adolescents away from the tree line. In the market towns, pamphlets turned rumor into a commodity. Artists and preachers painted the night in broad strokes, and those broad strokes hardened into lore and into legend. Today, the old fear has softened into fascination. Practitioners of modern earth-centered faiths reclaim names and dates, Samhain, All Hallows, the witching hour, and read them as times of remembrance, of honoring ancestors rather than calling down curses. Historians peel back the layers to find patterns, how scarcity breeds accusation, how changing power structures recast neighbors as enemies, and how ritual can be both protection and provocation. When we study the Sabbaths now, we do it with a softer light, trying to hear the people behind the accusations rather than only the voices that accuse them. So when the bells ring this year and the children run between porch lights, take a moment to remember those who once gathered in the cold. Remember the women who stitched charms into shawls and men who watched the horizon for omens. Remember the nights when a simple herb could make the difference between life and death, and when rumor could do the same. Above all, remember that every story has at least two sides, the one we whisper in fear and the one we tell when we are ready to listen. If you enjoyed this journey through shadow and story, be sure to subscribe to Bedtime Myths and Mysteries for more tales woven from history and whisper. On Halloween night, remember, every light pushes back a little of the dark, but the stories behind that light linger longer than any lamp. Sleep with one eye open and listen for the music of the old fires.